In the beginning was the Word. The passage that opens the Gospel of John is among the best-known sentences ever written in the Greek language, and it has undoubtedly sparked more debate than any other. Its age-old interpretation has defined the religious views of millions of people. The King James Bible, which has been regarded as authoritative for more than 400 years, translates the first full sentence as follows: In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word, as the same text tells us, later came into our world as the most famous person in history, Jesus, the Son of God. Most modern-day English Bible translations follow the King James Bible or render this first sentence in much the same way. In fact, in all the translations you can find on the comprehensive website BibleGateway.com, the Word, who was in the beginning with God, was himself also God. Scholars have recognized that this translation is not without problem. One commentator argues that there is a danger that this might lead the contemporary reader of the English text to collapse the Word and God into one. In other words, the traditional translation may cause the reader to wrongly conclude that the Word was the same person as the God he was with. In this video, we will look into the Gospel writer's use of the Greek word for God, theos. This may help us find out whether an alternative translation would better suit the author's intentions. A translation that is fundamentally different already exists. That is the New World Translation, available on the website jw.org. Let's look up John chapter 1 verse 1 in that Bible. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. This translation suggests that the Word was a second God next to the God with whom he was in the beginning. Given the Gospel writer's obvious monotheism, this translation seems implausible to most. There is only one God, so how could there be another one? And yet, some new considerations make this interpretation rather less unlikely. And as we will see later on, the notion of a secondary divine being who is non-competitive actually exists in early Christian writings that appeared mere decades after the Gospel of John was written. Moreover, there is a compelling linguistic reason to take this alternative translation seriously. It is time to take a look at the original Greek of the Gospel's prologue with a word-for-word translation in which the word for God, theos, occurs 3 times. For the sake of clarity, I will leave the word theos untranslated.
Εν αρχή είναι ο Λόγος, και ο Λόγος είναι προς τον Θεόν, και Θεός είναι ο Λόγος, ούτως είναι εν αρχή προς τον Θεόν.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with the theos, and the Word was theos. He was in the beginning with the theos. Like English, Greek makes use of the article, but different from English, the article is always definite. There is no indefinite article. This will become relevant later on. Here we see the article with ho logos, the Word. What is worthy of note is that the article is also used to indicate God. The Word was with the theos or the God. In modern languages, it is customary to refer to God without the article, but in John's Greek, God, otherwise called the Father, in most instances goes with the article. Let's now look at the phrase, and the Word was theos. As in the 2 previous instances, the Word is the subject. Theos is the predicate. There is no article here. The distinction between the theos, referring to God the Father, and theos without the article, referring to the Word, is invisible in the traditional English translation. One important 19th century New Testament scholar gave a brief comment that most scholars still agree with today. It is necessarily without the article, inasmuch as it describes the nature of the Word and does not identify his person. So, theos without the article is not meant to identify the Word with the theos. It answers the question naturally raised by the opening statement. Not who, but what was that entity that in the beginning could be with the God. A modern scholar summarizes the consensus as follows. Theos signifies the nature proper to God and the Word in common. And another, the Word shared the essence of the Father, though they differed in person. So, Theos is by most interpreters viewed as a divine substance. The Word was sharing with the God. To convey this in English, many scholars settle for a paraphrase and translate, what God was, the Word was. Now, the nature of the Word, or his substance, changed when he came into our world. Whereas the Word was Theos in chapter 1 verse 1c, in verse 14 the Word became flesh. Like in chapter 1 verse 1c, the Word is the subject. There is a copular verb and a predicate. The Word was Theos and became flesh, coming into the world as Jesus Christ in flesh and bone. Note that in English we don't translate he became a flesh or he became the flesh, but simply he became flesh. Flesh denotes the substance Jesus was made of when he had come to our world. Something similar can be said of a different substance that also underwent a change. This happens in the second chapter of the Gospel of John. During the wedding at Cana, Jesus performed his first miracle. What was the nature of the liquid in the water jars? When the master of the banquet took a sip out of the jars, it turned out that the water had become wine. The water did not turn into a wine or the wine, but simply into wine. English requires no article here. The liquid had changed nature or substance, and everybody was happy. Let's look at another passage that again concerns the nature of God's Son, the one who had become flesh. In John chapter 10 verse 33, some of his enemies profess their outrage towards him. You, being a man, make yourself Theos. The human nature of Jesus was obvious to his enemies. Instead of saying, you being flesh, they said, you being anthropos, a man. With nouns like man, the indefinite article, which does not exist in Greek, needs to be added in an English translation. That is because it is a generic term. If you use a generic term to define someone's nature, it automatically involves a concrete individual. A crucial question for the understanding of John chapter 1 verse 1 is, can Theos be like flesh, or water, or wine, denoting a substance or an essence? Or is Theos like anthropos, a generic term? In a book specifically about the Gospel of John, one scholar states, Theos is a generic term, referring to a being or beings of a certain sort. In all other instances in the Gospel of John, whether referring to God the Father, to the Word, or even to others, Theos always is a generic term, as it is in classical Greek. If John's use of the noun Theos as a generic term is consistent, the translation, the Word was a God, is legitimate. But there's a catch. One commentator notes, John, as a monotheistic Jew, would hardly have referred to another person as a God. There is of course no question that the Gospel writer worshipped only one God. John quotes Jesus referring to ho Theos, the God, as the only God and the only true God. However, the term monotheism itself may bring the risk of limiting our perspective. As one leading scholar notes, the problem is that the dictionary definition of monotheism typically requires the denial of the existence of any more than one deity, and it is not always clear that ancient Jews and Christians were concerned to do this. Over the last couple of decades, several scholars have noted this and have urged that monotheism is not a suitable term in describing ancient Jewish and Christian religious stances. For ancient Jews and ancient Christians as well, the primary concern was not to deny the existence of other divine beings, but instead to avoid or refuse offering worship to any being other than the one biblical God. We will see later that this observation also applies to the Gospel of John. First, there is another matter that needs consideration. It is not only the author's personal view we have to take into account, but also the audience the author had in mind. A reader-centered approach may help us turn our focus to the question of how the author anticipates the way his audience will interpret his words. So, the question is, what kind of audience did John have in mind? John begins with language that is not restricted to any religious setting. John's work would have had appeal in the universalizing and transcendent Hellenistic religious world. If John intentionally addressed a religiously and culturally diverse audience outside of the Judeo-Christian worldview, we may well ask how he would anticipate their understanding of his phrasing. First, ho Theos itself, the God with whom the Word was. For a Gentile reader, ho Theos no more necessarily implied the existence of one God than ho Anthropos, the man, implied the existence of only one human being. Ho Theos in open contexts practically never denotes a unique God. So the mention of the God does not at all immediately make the reader associate the opening sentence with monotheism. Now verse 1c. What were Gentiles used to when they would hear the word theos as a predicate followed by a copular verb? Let's look at some examples from classical texts. Take this quotation from the earliest and best-known work in classical Greek literature, the Iliad of Homer. Apollo says to Achilles, "Haven't you recognized that I am Theos?" Or Plato, the most widely read philosopher of ancient Greece. Then how could the one not sharing in beautiful and good things be Theos? Or from a poem lauding Homer, "If Homer is Theos, let him be revered among immortals." In these three examples, we have to translate Theos as a god. Now, of course, all these examples are taken from texts with a polytheistic worldview, but that is the frame of reference many of John's early reader audience would have had. More importantly, all these examples are about nature. What is Apollo? A god. Theos is a generic term, just like man is. This is the case in all other chapters in John, so it is very likely that this also applies to chapter 1, verse 1c. Let us consider an interesting example from another passage in John's Gospel. In chapter 10, verse 34, Jesus quotes Psalm 82, verse 6, in which God says, "I said, you are gods." In this quotation, it is God himself who addresses a group whose members are together defined in the plural as theoi, gods. It stands to reason that if God would have approached these members individually rather than collectively, he would have said theos ei to each one of them, which would mean not "you are God," but "you are a god." The English language requires the indefinite article in the singular simply because the word theos, like anthropos, is a generic term. It is important to stress the fact that, because the indefinite article does not exist in Greek, a phrase like anthropos ei or theos ei has a slightly different feel than "you are a man" or "you are a god" has to a speaker of English. In these phrases, the nouns denote nature, but in the singular they need to be translated with the indefinite article. Jesus' quotation of Psalm 82 is also important in that it shows something crucial about the use of the word theos in biblical texts. The use of the word theos is not restricted to the monotheistic God, but allows for a wider use, including sons of God or people performing actions on behalf of God. In Psalm 82, it is God himself who applies the term God to those who are expected to do as he requires, not as entities who hold a claim to worship. Since God's Son, as his foremost agent, with the greatest possible responsibilities, unfailingly does what God requires, it stands to reason that the Son could also be referred to as a distinct but non-competitive divine being who was in the beginning with the God. Finally, let us consider what may be viewed as actual evidence of early reader response to the Gospel of John. In the first half of the 2nd century, Justin Martyr was a prolific early Christian writer. Much work has been put into assessing Justin's familiarity with the Gospels. Charles Hale concluded that Justin knew the Gospel of John very well. We may surmise that John's prologue played a formative role in Justin's understanding of Christ as the Word of God. Justin writes about God's Son and the Word of God, and in words reminiscent of John's prologue, he says, "The Word of God is Theos." There's no question here that Theos needs to be translated as a God, for there are several other passages from which it is clear that Justin saw the Word as a separate deity. There is and is said to be another God and Lord under the Maker of the universe. This God who is begotten of the Father of the universe. Justin's view can of course not be used to prove or disprove how John meant chapter 1 verse 1c to be read, but it is valid to say that in his phrasing similar to John's, the 2nd century Christian philosopher Justin evidently understood Theos in reference to the word as a generic term it naturally is. If he saw the word as a God just decades after John's Gospel was written, the question is whether the Gospel writer himself would find this interpretation an infringement of his own beliefs. Wrapping things up. The purpose of this video is to show that a lesser-known alternative translation deserves serious consideration. It's up to you to decide which option you find more compelling. The word was God, or the word was a God. Linguistically, there is no objection against translating the word was a God. On the contrary, since the Gospel's prologue is inclusive in its approach of a diverse reader audience, it is very likely that the language does not deviate from a Gentile person's standard practice. Since the noun theos had always been a generic term, a Gentile reader would understand the word to be a second God. Moreover, in other instances of theos throughout the Gospel, the writer does not deviate from common practice, which makes it unlikely that he would do so in the case of chapter 1, verse 1c. There is also no infringement of John's own worship of the only one God. In his understanding of the word, theos does not inherently include a claim to worship, but can be applied to other individuals who work together with the one and only God, who is exclusively deserving of worship. Nor would John be unique in holding this view, as is evident from the writings of Justin Martyr, and it is from Justin that we learn that not long after the Gospel of John was written, its opening lines were understood to present the Word of God as a second God. That means that any modern Bible translation that interprets the word as a God reflects the earliest Christian interpretation.